Ryloth, Endgame. =RK equals. Part 5. Lesu, Ryloth. I jumped out of the command walker before it ground to a halt behind the crash-landed escort carrier. That gave me a splendid view of the wall surrounding the city. A section of it, just to the right of the retaliation, exploded outwards, showering the chasm separating us from Lesu with fist-sized chunks of metal. I cracked a small smile. The combat engineers were doing splendid work. Soon enough, there would be a nice hole in the wall, more than big enough for my tanks. However, first my armor needed a bridge in order to reach the city, and I wasn't crazy enough to try capturing the plasma one leading to the main gates. Unless whoever was in charge of the Sith forces was a babbling fool, that approach would be a death trap. So I had something else planned. I turned my attention to the converted container ship. It was carrying half of the improvised bridging equipment which my fleet had loaded on Coruscant. It was quite simple, really. The basic component were sheets of warship-grade armor, on which my engineers had worked while we were in transit to Ryloth. What those things were remade into was a modular bridge which could be deployed fast, provided that you had the necessary heavy equipment to move the segments and a few engineers to anchor the ends of the bridge on the two sides of whatever you wanted to cross. Or a powerful force adept who could do the heavy lifting and possibly speed up the process. Give me covering fire if necessary and make sure that the engineers get their asses here ASAP, I ordered before closing my eyes and concentrating. I lifted the topmost container containing the necessary equipment and floated it to the edge of the chasm. I used the force to rip open its doors and willed the bridge sections to move. They flew out, one after another, and headed to the edge of the cliffs. A squad of walkers carrying a platoon of combat engineers and their toys strode past me and started disgorging their cargo. The clones hurried towards the point where I wanted the bridge built and prepared to anchor it to the ground. =RK equals. Obi-Wan ducked under a shot from a Sith tank, which struck the side of a building 20 meters behind him. He deflected a burst from the secondary weaponry of the armored vehicle with saber. He sagged with relief when 2 AP missiles ended the threat before its main cannon could speak again. "Send the next 2 platoons over the wall at our left flank," Kenobi shouted to his aide who had taken cover behind the nearby wreck of a burning aircar. "Right away, sir." The Jedi gave the clone a satisfied nod before glancing at his surroundings. They had taken the defenders by surprise. That was the only explanation to the confused and uncoordinated resistance the Republic forces were facing, which was a very good thing. The Sith had about 60,000 droids within the capital. At least, that was the reasonable estimate. Kenobi wouldn't be surprised if they had twice those numbers. Nevertheless, at the moment that didn't particularly matter. The main droid forces were concentrated to cover the main doors leading into the city. Those troops were redeploying to shore up their right flank but were not even trying any spoiling counterattacks. Apparently their commander was thinking that his other forces were more than enough to handle the Gar bridgehead or believed it to be a diversion. Kenobi's biggest problem was a Sith armor battalion, whose lead elements were hitting his left flank. The Jedi had only at infantry to throw against them, but that should be sufficient at the moment. Even if the droids managed to overrun that flank, it wouldn't be before the walkers were inside the city. He had received reports that the combat engineers had started blowing up the wall and that Vale was aiding another group in constructing the bridge. It remained to be seen whether Tambor could be captured alive, or if they would have to clean up the city the hard way. =RK equals. Chris flew over a deserted street after dealing with another proton cannon, when she noticed movement on a nearby roof. She banked in that direction, activating the zoom function on her helmet. A pair of commando droids were setting up shop on a building to her right. One of them was carrying a big-ass rifle, almost as tall as it was. A sniper and his spotter. How cute. She raced their way and sent her last light missile at them. The spotter noticed the incoming ordnance in time and jumped back, getting out of the kill radius of the weapon. The sniper had time to look her way before the missile struck the body of the weapon in the robot's hands. The resulting explosion obscured the Mandalorian woman from the view of the spotter. She appeared from the cloud of smoke and dust like a swooping bird of prey and opened fire. The second commando droid managed to send a single shot her way before she blasted it with her pistols. The droid managed to hit her, however the blaster bolt merely melted a part of the armor protecting her left shoulder, leaving Chris unharmed. She flew away, searching for a secure location. Minute later, Bo-Katan landed on a deserted terrace and smashed through the glass door separating it and the nearby room. She darted inside the apartment building and swept the flat for enemies. Once Chris was sure that she was safe for a few moments, she started reloading her weapons. She had made it about 2 kilometers into the city, passing the outer ring of Sis forces. On her way, Bo had taken out 3 artillery positions and about a company of droids. When she finished reloading everything, she checked her remaining ordnance. It was a good thing that she had started this insane operation with triple her usual munition load. The only downside was that her rocket pack fuel was at 60% thanks to the heavy load she started with. No matter what she had left would do. Bo-Katan had to scout the Sis command posts for Tambor and report his location to the Gar forces, and to capture him if practical. She pressed a button on her left arm guard and a map of Lesu appeared over her hand. "Where are you?" she muttered while her eyes were scanning the locations of the command posts she knew about. =RK=, Republic Cruiser Requiem, high orbit over Ryloth. Multiple launches detected. Reported one of the clones manning the CIC of the Venator. We have Sis fighters rising all over the planet. All units, this is Requiem. Initiate fire plan red. Another clone spoke calmly in the comm unit built in his station. All over Ryloth, CR-90s and Keraks slashed through the upper layers of the atmosphere to send a barrage of laser or ion fire. After a few shots, the Republic light ships retreated back into space, where they were beyond the reach of the Sis proton cannons. Whole squadrons of droid fighters and bombers disappeared in firestorms caused by the near-orbital strikes. Even shots that missed their targets and would be harmless in space, hit the ground creating explosions and shock waves that obliterated all nearby small craft. After the first pass, 2/3 of the nearly 1,000 droid fighters had been turned in so much rubble. That would be followed by precision ion cannon strikes and 2 squadrons of torrents led by Ahsoka, which would hunt down the remaining enemy bombers. Before the brief air raid was stopped cold, the Sis forces managed to bomb only a single village, which was uncomfortably close to a camouflaged Sis installation and one of the industrial sites in the southern hemisphere. Minutes later, there would be a cruiser over all previously unknown Confederate bases. Blue and green lances would pierce the heavens, obliterate those facilities. =RK=, holding Camp Helos, Southern Hemisphere, Ryloth. Cody led his command section to the outskirts of the camp once the perimeter was secure. Before him, the leading elements of 3 battalions were storming the enemy positions. The droids defending the camp never stood a chance. It appeared that all their plans were centered upon preventing the locals from escaping and dealing with the occasional harassing attack by the lightly armed resistance forces. When hit by the missile launchers of a single battalion, they simply disintegrated as a coherent fighting force. Instead of the coordinated resistance Cody had expected, his men were confronted by a squad here, half a platoon there, and single tanks often without any infantry support. Those enemy forces were quickly overwhelmed by the concentrated fire of the clones. Within 10 minutes of the first shot, there was not a single intact droid left within the camp. It was the first time in his career that a plan went off without too big of a hitch. There would be precious few times when that would happen again. Nevertheless, it wasn't an entirely one-sided affair. He lost 30 men when one of his leading companies was hit in both flanks by a platoon-strength super battle droid detachment and the only Sis tank with sufficient infantry support. There were also a 40-odd wounded when all was said and done. However, none of that reflected the situation of the locals. Many of the Twi'lek were sick and starving. Too many for his limited number of medics to help them all before it was too late. When the dust settled days later, it would be revealed that more than 15,000 people had perished in that single camp. Only 100 had been wounded or died as a consequence of the clones' attack. =RK=, Lesu, Ryloth. It took us 15 minutes to have a 70 meters wide bridge over the chasm surrounding the capital. In that time the combat engineers widening the city had managed to demolish 20-meter wide area of the tough wall. For the moment that should be good enough. Already, 10 tanks were through the breach and the rest of my leading armor battalion were moving in. Meanwhile, the droids defending the main approach to the city had decided to move their metal butts and my right flank was under attack by a regiment of enemy infantry. Their forward elements had ran headfirst into a hastily prepared kill zone, which ran along an avenue leading to the center of the city. While I was finishing moving the bridge segment, I could hear how that attack was handled. "Here they come," declared a nameless clone. "Wait for them," ordered the captain in charge. "We are under fire," stated another of my men. "Loki is hit. We need a medic over here." "The clankers are coming like they are on a criffing parade," someone exclaimed. "Can the chatter? 10 more seconds and blow the charges," ordered the captain. "Wilco, sir." Even from my position I could hear when the mines were detonated. It sounded like one long explosion which, thanks to the echo, went on and on. "Watch them burn," one of my men shouted gleefully. "Ready iron grenades. I want their next charge broken before they can cross the street." Soon afterwards, the last pieces of the bridge were secured. To my left, the walkers were already crossing and heading in. When the construction work was over, I headed to my command tank, which was parked nearby. I needed few minutes of rest in order to replenish some of the force energies I expended doing the heavy lifting. It wasn't glamorous, but without dedicated bridging equipment that could be used in this case I had to improvise. Inside I found 5 of the clones who were a new addition to my command. Those folks were my staff, and their presence had made a lot of my work as a general somewhat manageable. I looked at the various displays showing the progress of my troops. My men had captured nearly 5 square kilometers. There was heavy fighting on the flanks, but strangely enough the path forward wasn't heavily contested. It was tempting to send an armor column thundering straight into the center of the city, but that would leave them vulnerable if one of the flanks collapsed. I want an armor company to reinforce the right flank. Send the rest of the 7th Walker Battalion to encircle the enemy battalion hitting our left flank. 7th Battalion was the vanguard of my columns entering Lesu. =RK=. Bo-Katan grinned like a cat who had just eaten the canary. She was near the main SIS command and control center within Lesu, when she saw a group of droids exiting the building. They were followed by the unmistakable figure of Wat Tambor, who headed towards the APC in the center of a column of separatists' vehicles. There were 4 tanks in both ends with 10 personnel carriers in between. Chris would bet a lot on 2 things. First, that each of those machines was chock full with droids. And second, they weren't heading towards the fighting. Overlord Actual. This is Huntress. I have a visual on Black King. He is preparing to leave Point Eagle. Requesting instructions. Over. Affirmative, Huntress. Wait 1. This is Rogue Knight. Tail him. I'm heading your way with reinforcements. Bo-Katan's smile became a hungry one. She loved stalking her prey. Ryloth, Endgame. =RK=. Part 6. Lesu, Ryloth. I stared at the map of the city. The best route we could take to intercept the convoy passed through that glaring hole in the enemy lines, which appeared to lead straight into the center of Lesu. The whole thing smelled of an obvious trap. However, given the average tactical competence I've seen so far from both the SIS and the GAR, I wouldn't put it past the Seps to be just that incompetent. It wasn't like such a kerfuffle was particularly worse than their usual penchant for marching towards our lines in a nice square formations that doubled as artillery bait. Something I was going to prove the moment I got my hands on some indirect fire arty, or the standard beam type when I could use it against the droids on open ground. Despite that, I couldn't just assume that whoever was in charge of the SIS here was an idiot. That would be a good way to get a lot of my men killed. This is Overlord Actual. Send in the hover tanks once 7th Armor Battalion enters the city. They are to split in company strength and commence reconnaissance in force, I ordered and turned my head towards one of my staff officers. Pack, you have tactical command. I'm heading in with the recon elements. If we can get Tambor, we can end this mess now. Yes, sir. He answers and started snapping orders to the tank crews. 5 minutes later I was entering Lesu. I was on top of one of the hover tanks, holding a handle wielded to its hull. Before we reached Ryloth, I had all of those machines modified so they could transport a squad of infantry each. Thanks to the tank's shields, the troopers had a reasonable degree of protection while riding on top. It was a useful stopgap measure that allowed me to quickly transport a strike force of infantry and armor while I waited for the R&D boffins to get a dedicated IFV designed. Using the walkers, which were not only relatively slow with their 60 km/h top speed, but were also my dedicated armor force, wasn't practical for transporting infantry in a lot of cases. Like right now, when those things were not only needed elsewhere, but were too slow for what I needed to get done. 6 companies of hover tanks spread out from the breach in the enemy defenses and headed deeper into the city. I had given orders for my recon units to avoid the area around the main entrance where the majority of CIS forces were located. So most of the tanks headed either towards the free passage at the center of the enemy lines, or looped around the bulk of 7th Battalion, which was moving to flank the enemy armor assaulting our left flank. =RK=. Bo-Katan had been tracking the CIS column for nearly 15 minutes. They had bypassed the majority of hangars she knew of and were steadily moving to the part of the city furthest from the GAR attack. Incidentally, that was the area of Lesu where the main spaceport was located, complete with the largest concentration of CIS air assets in the region. Chris had thought it strange that the SEPs hadn't used their air power against the breach and the city defenses until now. Then, suddenly, everything became obvious. Tambor was hoarding his remaining vultures, believing that they would be able to screen his escape from the planet. That was unlikely considering that majority of the Republic fleet and system was parked over the capital. Though, considering what he was responsible for, Tambor would grasp at any chance to get away. She could imagine what would happen to him if Vale turned him over to the locals, and that was something she could see the general doing in order to make an example of the CIS leader. From her position on the top of a tall building, she glanced at her map, then at the city strewn below her. Unless the CIS convoy took a right at the next intersection, they would have to pass through a choke point in order to reach the spaceport. Bo checked the ordnance she carried. She still had the 4 blocks of explosives she had taken on a whim from one of the Republic armories. She smirked at the CIS column which moved past the next intersection without even slowing down. Bo-Katan activated her rocket pack and flew towards the spaceport. =RK=. Obi-Wan allowed himself a tiny smile. The flanking attack on the CIS armor assaulting the GAR left flank worked like a charm. That Separatists battalion was annihilated in full when 7th Armor struck them from the left and rolled up their own flank. As a direct consequence, the Republic forces were now able to spread in that direction, giving them options other than assaulting the teeth of the CIS defenses around the main gate or going straight into what was now confirmed to be a trap. The recon units scouting the main, supposedly enemy-free, approaches to the center of the city, had nearly ran into a particularly nasty ambush. Those tanks were pulling back in an attempt to break contact with what appeared to be a regiment of enemy infantry supporting another CIS armor battalion. Right now, those Confed forces were moving straight at the Republic positions. Kenobi looked around. A 2nd battalion of walkers was already in the city, but that might not be enough to stop the advancing enemy battalion Colt. Not with the regiments of droids concentrated at the GAR right flank. Obi-Wan's eyes fell on the combat engineers who had demolished a section of the walls and now were busy preparing defensive positions at the center of the Republic positions. He looked at the tall buildings flanking the main avenue through which the droids would need to pass if they decided to attack head-on, as usual, and smiled. That smile was out of place on a Jedi's face. =RK=. Wat Tambor was staring gloomily at the brown interior of one of the rare APC carriers the CIS possessed. Those machines were exclusively reserved for moving the Confederation leadership when air transport was not available for one reason or another. He had considered taking an aircar to the spaceport, but quickly disregarded that idea. It would have been a foolish thing to do with that criffing traitor Chris wreaking havoc throughout the city. No matter. The convoy should be more than enough to protect him from a single Mandalorian cutthroat. His bigger problem was getting off-world. Tambor had no illusions about what would happen to him if he was taken alive. When he planned this enterprise it all looked so simple. The Republic was losing the war and it was only a matter of time before its military collapsed under the onslaught of countless droids. However, all that was before that New Republic general captured or killed 2 of the highest-ranking Confederation leaders, placing the quick resolution of the war into question. So he decided to hedge his bets and give the CIS military a boost. Until his brilliant diplomatic coup, the Hutts were either neutral or somewhat supportive to the Republic cause. But he had ended all that nonsense. Now the overgrown worms were on their side and all it took was capturing a bunch of Twi'lek no one really cared about. It wasn't like those people were important. Tambor's indignant musings were rudely interrupted. Twin explosions shook the CIS column, making the column ground to a halt. The pair of tanks leading the Confed forces were obliterated a split second before the trailing 2 met the same fiery fate. To put the situation into perspective, The droids escorting Tambor had taken the shortest route to the spaceport, disregarding everything else. That led them straight through a narrow street, which was now blocked by the burning remains of the armored vehicles. To add insult to injury, Bo-Katan flew over the street on which the convoy was now stranded, sending half of her remaining missiles at the APCs near the one carrying Tambor. Those weapons hit the thinner upper armor of the vehicles, wrecking the top-mounted weaponry and in one case breaching the troop compartment. Inside, the B-2 droids were bathed by the condensed overpressure which scalded the inside of the armored vehicle. A moment later only 2 of the 10 super battle droids were still combat effective. =RK=. This is insane. Waxer screamed. I had to agree, despite this being my damned to hell plan. Which in fact seemed to work. At least partially. The remaining recon forces were not only pinpointing CIS positions, but were also drawing the attention of the enemy forces. That allowed us to slip through the positions which the droids were fortifying in an attempt to stave off the inevitable GAR assault into this sector of the city. It looked like that after the destruction of that CIS armor battalion, there weren't any separatists' forces on our left flank that were big enough to try anything larger than a spoiling counterattack. The main enemy forces appeared to be concentrated at the main gate and near the center, which left us a large corridor where we could spread out and fortify. As long as my men were able to hold the breach in the city wall, that is. That at least looked good. By now, there was more than an armor battalion reinforcing the regiment holding my force's right flank. Even better, moments ago Obi-Wan gave me a gleeful report. He used the combat engineers to rig 6 buildings, which he blew up in such a way that they buried a battalion of enemy infantry as well as at least 2 tank companies. That had left the leading elements of a regimental strength counterattack by the separatists facing my hastily dug-in forces unsupported. Those droids were slaughtered in short order. All that was well and good, but didn't particularly help my situation. I was gripping a handhold for a dear life, while the tank carrying me was racing through the largely deserted streets at more than 100 kilometers per hour. The operative word here was largely. There were various group of droids which were converging towards the breach. They loved sending fat shots our way as we practically flew through their ranks. Thanks to the shields, that was usually not a real threat. Yet, there were exceptions. On 2 occasions we met B-1s carrying missile launchers. While the single hits they managed were harmlessly absorbed by the shields of my tanks, the sheer force of the impacts and resulting explosions shook the hit tanks. Some of my men were unable to hold on and were thrown off the hovercraft. Needless to say, at this speed none of them survived hitting the ground. That wasn't the worst. We passed through an intersection towards which a column of enemy armor was advancing. Half of my tanks roared past the enemy unscratched, before the droids in charge got their shit together and opened fire. Accurate fire. The trailing 2 tanks were struck multiple times. They, as well as the men they carried, were turned into so much confetti. At least that was the last true obstacle we met before breaking into the enemy rear. After the close encounter with the enemy armor, we faced only one more enemy unit, a platoon of B-1 and B-2 droids marching straight in the middle of the street my tanks passed through. Veers, who was in charge of the hover tank company, merely slowed down a bit so we wouldn't be thrown off and rammed them through. It wasn't as effective as it would have been if we had threaded vehicles, but it was good enough. =RK=. I laid eyes on Bo-Katan's handiwork and smiled coldly. She had stopped the convoy carrying Tambor cold. I could clearly see the pair of burning CIS tanks which were part of its rear guard. She was still tracking Tambor and attacking his escort. He was trying to reach the spaceport, which was 2 kilometers from here, but was moving slower than a crippled bantha thanks to her constant harassment. I had my men dismount and sent the light tanks towards the spaceport. I intended to run down my target long before he could reach his destination, but I wanted my light armor to cut him off just in case. We made a short work of the enemy armored column, which stood no chance, stranded as it was. All it took was some thermal detonators, which were thrown by my men, and I guided towards the enemy armored vehicles. The powerful explosive devices wrecked the enemy column and we headed towards our target. The reason I wasted a bit of time to destroy those Confed vehicles was simple. I didn't want that force at my back despite them being prevented from moving for the time being. I found Tambor hidden behind the column in front of an ancient-looking building. He was surrounded by 70-odd droids, who were shooting in the air in an attempt to take down Bo-Katan. She was strafing them using her blaster pistols. It was obvious that she couldn't get close enough to use her guns effectively without getting shot down, but it was apparent that the CIS leader didn't know that, so he was hunched down behind his cover. Splendid. It was time to end this battle. =RK=. Tambor cringed when he saw the distinctive forms of Republic soldiers appearing from a side alley to his left. The enemy troopers wasted no time. Approximately half of them opened fire while the rest ran for cover. All but the man who was obviously leading them did that. "Oh, Criff it all," whispered the leader of the Techno Union. That man simply strode in the blaster fire of his droids. He had a red lightsaber in his right hand and used it to swat aside the shots aimed at him. Then that man, who could only be General Vale, the accursed leader of the Republic forces which had destroyed Tambor's plans, raised his free hand. Tambor's eyes would have fallen out of their sockets if they hadn't been replaced by cybernetic implants. A stream of purple lightning erupted from the man's palm and struck down nearly half of the droids. More of the machines were cut down by blaster fire, a few of them by their own shots reflected back at them. Another lightning attack all but destroyed the remaining droids, with the survivors lasting a handful of seconds longer. Tambor shook with fear. He could feel unnatural dread gripping his heart with icy fingers. The politician tried to steel himself. He still had few valuable bargain chips. "Wat Tambor," whispered the general's voice, which was distorted by the helmet he wore into an unnerving hiss. "General Vale, perhaps we can reach a compromise?" he asked, trying to remove the telltale trembling from his voice. "I have a better idea," said the general. "You will deactivate all the droids on Ryloth, and I won't give you to the locals. They seem to be a bit peeved with you. I wonder why." Despite the way his voice was distorted by the helmet, Tambor could hear the sarcasm dripping from Vale's words. "That isn't enough. I want passage out of this system or you won't get the codes," he said with a determination he didn't feel. Vale simply shook his head and muttered, "They always choose the hard way. Well, it's better that way." The man strode towards him and Tambor moved backwards on instinct. Something deep inside him screamed that he should have accepted the general's terms. Suddenly, Tambor found himself paralyzed. He felt something touching his mind. Then the world exploded in a wave of crimson agony which engulfed his consciousness. =RK=. Kenobi was on the right flank, helping the clones stave off the main CIS counterattack when the droids froze in mid-motion before shutting down. His shoulders sagged in relief. Vale had done it. The CIS on Ryloth was finished. Nevertheless, the Jedi decided not to take any chances. "I want the city swept for any enemy stragglers. And make sure that those clankers stay down for good. I don't want someone reactivating them and catching us off guard," he ordered. The latter was a very real possibility. After all, the droids were simply shut down, not destroyed. Something which will be taken care of soon. =RK=. General Syndulla, who had been leading his fighters and 2 companies of clones through the city sewers towards the complex containing the shield generators protecting the city, allowed himself a small smile. What was left of his people were now free. If the Republic kept its word. Yet it was too late for millions, perhaps more. He looked up to the ceiling and the stars beyond it, ignoring the cheering of his fighters. Despite this victory, he had a sense of foreboding. After the atrocities that the damned separatists committed here on Ryloth, as well as on Naboo and Coruscant, the war was far from over. He could almost feel it. =RK=. Bo-Katan landed near Vale and looked at him. He had Tambor pressed against the wall and had his right hand pressed to the CIS leader's forehead. They stayed that way for about 5 minutes despite her few attempts to get answers from the infuriating man. The clones on the other hand had acted as that had been business as usual and simply took up defensive positions around them. When Vale was finally finished, he released Tambor. The leader of the Techno Union activated his comm and started typing a long code before speaking with an empty voice. "It is done. The droids are deactivated. This is the data you require." He continued to type for a minute before retrieving a data chip and handling it to the general. "Splendid," answered Vale. He turned towards his men and ordered, "Take him into custody. I want him on a shuttle to the Requiem ASAP and move him straight to the med bay where he should be treated for possible brain damage." Then Del-Qatar activated his wrist-mounted computer, plugged in the chip and started working ignoring everyone else. "Is that it?" she snapped at him. That man had the gall to ignore her. Yeah. The majority of enemy forces are inactive. There are probably a few commander droids which will be pain in the ass until my men and the locals hunt them down, but there isn't much I can do about that anyway. Now, if you excuse me, I am a bit busy. Bo-Katan gave him a dirty look. With what? You just said that the enemy has been dealt with. Denying the enemy some liquid assets. That usually meant money. Despite not being a mercenary, Bo was very interested in what Del-Qatar was doing. =RK=, Chancellor's office, undisclosed location, Coruscant. Palpatine's right eye twitched. Days. 3 criffing days, and Vale had Ryloth more or less secured. Enough at least, that he could move most of his forces away from that world soon, and the general himself would be returning to Coruscant in a week or so. It was a good thing that he had a lot of plans going on at the same time. At least the whole debacle on Ryloth wasn't a total loss. Now he had a reasonable idea of how dangerous Vale was as both a ground and a space commander. Now that he knew, Sidious could plan better for the future. Besides, there were other bright spots. With the crushing defeat at space, the Confederation would have to stop its offensives within 2 to 3 weeks and start consolidating before another major push could be launched. So with a bit of tweaking, Palpatine could ensure that he would get the long war he needed. Ironically, he could use Vale until both sides were truly stalemated. Until such a time, which was still months away, Sidious should have decided if he would want that man as his new apprentice or if the good general would meet an unfortunate accident somewhere. The Sith Lord grinned. 2 weeks. Then he would have some free entertainment to look up to. The trial of Windu was fast approaching. He just hoped that the Jedi would mess it up and do his job in destroying most of their reputation themselves. Meanwhile, he would be busy. After those idiots killed most of the Senate, and not even the right part, griff them all, he had to deal with a mountain of paperwork. On a more cheerful note, now it would be much easier to concentrate more power in his hand as he planned from the beginning. =RK=, Council Chambers, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. Yoda was sitting in his chair, and to anyone who would look at him, it appeared that he was meditating. However, that was not the case. He was pondering the future, both of the Republic and the Jedi Order. The present was changing in ways he could have never foreseen. Now he had to deal with the fallout of his own mistakes. With Vale coming from the past, Yoda was now almost certain that he had shaped the Order in a wrong way. He had prepared his people to fight the wrong kind of war. Against the influence of a Sith as Vale, they were in a bad position. The only ray of hope, where that man was concerned, was the fact that he apparently didn't hate the Jedi or desire their destruction as an ordinary Sith would. "Enough, it is not," muttered the ancient being. Vale's very existence was a threat to the Order's stability like no other. Arguably, Del-Qatar was as dangerous to the Jedi as the Sith who started the war, just in a different way. Yoda could almost appreciate the irony of this situation. Faced with a Sith who didn't want their destruction, the Jedi were about to shatter the Order themselves. There were many of his people who were blinded by the Jedi creed. They were seeing in absolutes, almost as a Sith would. Granted, he had been trying to slowly push for reforms, targeted at making the Jedi more open-minded. Yet, the truth was that he was far from successful. Or at least not as successful as he should be. Changing the Order was a very slow process, which was met with a lot of opposition. Despite what many outsiders might think, he was no dictator. As the Grand Master of the Jedi Order, Yoda was first amongst equals. It had taken him decades to build a somewhat progressive council so that on a good day he could push for some small changes. Now that looked scarcely enough. There was a rift forming amongst the Jedi, and soon it would all come to a head. Windu's trial was approaching, and Yoda had no idea how that would go. He had spoken with all the Jedi Masters and knew that they were evenly split right now. When Windu and Vale speak in front of the Council, everything will be decided. Yoda knew that for a lot of Jedi it won't be about the evidence, or whether Windu had broken the Republic's laws. In fact, in the eyes of many of his people, Vale and the Jedi supporting him will be the ones being judged. From the cradle, the Jedi had been taught that the Sith were the one true enemy. And now one of them was left to do whatever he wanted, or at least so it seemed. Yoda shrunk in his chair. He felt trapped in a net of his own making. Interlude 4. =RK=, Briefing Room, Assault Ship Leveler, High Orbit over Coruscant. I entered the room and sealed it behind me. I looked around at a sea of the same faces looking straight. There was a whole company of clones standing at attention, waiting me to act. I give them a sharp nod. They'll do. I went to the small dais at the left side of the room and spoke, "Stand at ease, men." I met the eyes of the newly promoted Captain Trek. He returned my look and I could clearly see his unflinching determination. I used the force to sweep the room for any active or passive listening devices just in case. I found none, but just in case I surrounded us in a dampening field which would ensure our privacy. You've all volunteered for a special assignment. As of this moment, you are officially part of 91st Reserve Company. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, your unit's only purpose is to provide replacements for casualties suffered by the forces under my command. Do you understand? Yes, sir. They spoke as one. You will undertake a special training regiment, which amongst other things will prepare you to face Force adepts and not only survive such an encounter, but win, I stated. During the last war I was part of, we, the Sith, trained ordinary people to become competent Jedi hunters amongst other things. These men in front of me were going to become a nucleus for such a force. While right now I didn't plan to fight the Jedi, I wanted to have troops able to go against them and win without overwhelming numeral superiority. Just in case. Besides, having my own Black Ops outfit could be useful for a lot of things. These men were special. I had not only removed the programming placed upon them by Sidious cronies on Kamino, but had used the Force to subtly probe their minds. That's how I had chosen who to recruit. I could be sure that these men would be molded into weapons who would obey only me when their training was complete. And that was without screwing with their minds with the Force. The downside of this method was that there was a tiny pool of future recruits, unless I wanted to mess with their heads to such an extent that they would be little more than slaves. In few months I would have the first Black Operations unit under my exclusive control. =RK=, lower levels, Coruscant. Officially, I was inspecting some of the equipment that my forces were expected to use as a break from the monotone work needed to turn my army and fleet from a fiction written on a datapad into reality. Which was slow-going, boring work as I knew it would be. In reality, I had discarded my recognizable armor for a dark, hooded robe and was going to a meeting into Coruscant's not-so-pleasant underbelly. After dealing with the pirates who had captured Dooku, I finally had some credits to burn, and I could start to build my power base outside the GAR. I was well aware that in the future I would need to do some distasteful things outside the official channels. I reached a small, nondescript, cantina. There were thousands just like it strewn all over Coruscant. I nodded at the bouncer, a bored-looking Trandosian, who was standing under a non-functional hollow panel, which usually was used for advertisements. "I'm here to see Vunks. Lorik sent me," I told him. He studied me for a moment, sniffed in my direction before nodding. "Back room. Don't make any trouble or I'll use your spine to clean up my teeth." He grunted and grinned at me. He had a lot of teeth. Big ones too. I could easily believe that he can use someone's spine to clean them. It wasn't my problem. I just shrugged and entered the cantina. Inside, I was greeted by a semi-dark expanse. The deep shadows did a great job of hiding everyone's faces. I briefly scanned the room and walked in once I felt that I wasn't in any more danger than the average visitor of this fine establishment. Then I immediately regretted not bringing my helmet. The damn place stank worse than a week-old battlefield, where no one bothered to retrieve the corpses. Perhaps it was because I was human. There was only one of my species inside and all others were aliens, a few of whom from species I wasn't familiar with. I ignored the looks that the patrons gave me and headed straight to the back room. There, I had the same conversation with a pair of guards that I had with the bouncer. They scanned me for weapons, but I countered that by projecting a dampening field over my lightsaber. Not surprisingly, it worked. That was a useful trick I had picked up from a Sith assassin during my training on Korriban. Thankfully, the back room had working ventilation and there the stench was mostly gone. I found myself across a plain desk, behind which was sitting a Rodian. His huge eyes were fixed on a data pad. In the four corners of the room were standing guards. A quartet of huge Trandosians armed with blaster carbines. "Sergeant Lorik sent you. Or so you claim," whispered the Rodian. "I'm his new business partner," I answered nonchalantly. "I need to procure a few ships and a lot of equipment. You came highly recommended. Who would have thought that a crooked supply sergeant could be such a spring of useful information? It was too bad that when I had finished with him his brain was ready to start leaking from his ears. Is that so? Then where is that shifty human? Dead. I deadpanned. The guards stiffened. I could feel that they were ready to pounce on me, figuratively speaking. Is that so? It's such a loss, he said in a tone, which made obviously that in his opinion it was anything but. Now, you just have to prove that you aren't some kind of law enforcement, and we can talk business. I smirked and take hold of the force. It swirled around me and I used it to grasp the necks of the four guard. A mental nudge in the correct directions and 4 almost simultaneous snaps could be heard. The dead mercenaries grumbled to the dirty floor. I looked at the shocked Rhodian. I guess that my little demonstration wasn't something that you see often, or at all, in this age. He tried to press a panic button under his desk, and no doubt summon more guards, but I had his hands in a secure telekinetic grip. Vonks, I believe that this is a sufficient demonstration? I asked, nodding to one of the cooling corpses. He stared at me for a long moment before frantically nodding. Yes. Obviously you were not with the security forces, he stammered. Now, I believe that you'll uphold your reputation and get me what I need? I asked cheerfully. Sith Negotiations 101. I was glad to see that it still worked. Yes. Sure, he exclaimed. That's great, Vonks. Now, here is what I need. A bulk freighter, which has docks for smaller ships. At least 3 smaller transport ships, which can dock with said freighter. Minimum 6 assault shuttles, 200 sets of medium armor. Same number of blaster rifles and pistols. By the time I had finished listing what I wanted to purchase, Vonks's eyes were wide for very different reason. I could feel the greed positively oozing from every pore of his green body. Nasty image that. You can pay, right? That will be 300. Minimum. Vonks. I muttered, making sure that he could feel the disappointment in my voice. He gulped and shuddered in fear. His greed had become secondary for the moment. I wanted to say that it will be no more than 300,000 in total, he stammered. This time he was telling me the truth. Splendid. We spent the next hour straightening up the details of our deal. RK equals. Republic Cruiser Requiem, high orbit over Coruscant. I was meeting with Trek in a secluded part of one of the Venator's hangars. That by itself was a normal sight. By now everyone knew that I made sure that I knew the men under my command. The coming ops on Naboo represents an opportunity for us, I said. Yes, sir. How many of us can be taken off the books? At least a squad. It won't be hard to list that many as casualties. Perhaps more, if everything goes to hell. I want your men to scout the locations of the primary list. If they find one of them uninhabited, inform me and start preparing the facilities there. What about civilian personnel? Asked the captain. It's unlikely that we'll be able to retrieve Force-sensitive kids under the noses of the Jedi anytime soon. However, if the opportunity arises, we may have to retrieve such children and their families so they are not indoctrinated. Start screening appropriate candidates for a small new colony. We'll go from there. Yes, sir.